John, I am so excited to be sitting here with you today. I know we did this probably 7 or 8, maybe 8 or 9 years ago in Austin. I've continued to track your journey, and you're just such a fascinating, cool, smart, impressive dude. And thank you for taking the time to be here with us today.
I'm happy to be with you, Aaron. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, I want to start with something that was a seminal moment for you, seminal moment in time for you, but maybe even more so for the world of technology. And I think anyone that knows you probably knows a little bit of this backstory, but I had forgotten some of the details. So in 1992, you, along with your co-founders, Jane Metcalf, who I've met, who's lovely, Kevin Kelly, Louis Rosetto, and John Plunkett launched this thing called Wired Magazine. And this was pre-internet days for those listening in that don't remember what pre-internet, or I should say pre-World Wide Web. The internet did exist. It was not anything near what we look like, what it looks like today. Tell us a little bit about that backstory behind this game-changing publication and the impact it's had on the tech world.
Yeah, thanks. It is kind of the one thing that I've been involved with that I would say more people know about than anything else I've done. And I'm proud of it, and I'm proud that it still exists, right? I mean, if you do something you want it, you know, like the book I wrote, I don't know, some years later is still in print, right? Like you want things you do to have some lasting impact. And I think Wired probably has been the biggest, best known, I suppose. Back in 1991, a year before that crew that you mentioned, we all got together to form what became Wired. I was in graduate school at UC Berkeley in journalism, and I was asked to write a proposal for my thesis. So it's a 2-year program. You spend your second year basically working on your thesis. And it's a long form piece of journalism if you're doing print, which is what I was doing at the time. Believe it or not, print was an actual, concentration. Or you do a long form documentary if you were doing film. I had been at a startup magazine as a reporter and a assistant managing editor in the late 1980s covering Apple. And I was responsible in the first year or two of that publication's existence for running the desktop publishing production process. And we used a beta piece of software, which was desktop publishing software called Quark. It
I
was
remember it well.
Yeah, it became the standard, the gold standard for desktop publishing for probably a decade. But at the time, it was a buggy piece of software, and I was a 21-year-old trying to make it work. But I learned how to make magazines essentially through that software. And so, fast forward to my first year of graduate studies, I told my dean that what I wanted to do was start a magazine. I had the technical skills to do the desktop publishing, but more importantly, I had the story in mind. And to me, the story was the impact of technology, digital technology on society. I thought that was the biggest story in the world in 1991. I didn't have a name for this magazine that I wanted to launch, but I called it the Rolling Stone of Technology. And my dean thought it was a bad idea, and he told me I couldn't do it. And, a year later, I had written a long, 25-page thesis paper on the impact of digital technologies on the media industry, which was a very useful thing to do, it turns out, because I made a lot of contacts doing the reporting for that, and had, pretty much forgotten about my master's thesis that I had wanted to do until I got a phone call that summer after I graduated. Oh, I was working at the LA Times, and this crazy man named Louis Rosetto called me out of the blue and said he had an open job at this new magazine he was going to start called Wired. And then he proceeded to describe my master's thesis proposal to me.
Crazy.
And I just said, oh my God, can we really do this? Because this is what I actually want to do. I think people are formed by the media that they grew up with. I grew up with magazines. They were very important to me when I was a kid. Television was limited in my household, but magazines were encouraged. And I think I just was a magazine person. And actually, for the past 35 years, I've been trying to figure out what is a magazine if it's not in print. And it's one of the reasons that I think a lot of the choices I made across my career have to do with communities of people that have a shared passion around a particular set of topics. Often that community takes form of an event, a conference or seminar series, or, online publication. But I'll be honest, Aaron, I have yet to find the thing digitally that feels the way like a high quality print magazine felt when it landed on your desk and you got that electric jolt of knowing you were sharing with a community of people the moment of opening that up and experiencing it. And you weren't doing it necessarily together. Usually you were alone, but it felt like you were connected in some very core way to a group of people who shared a set of values and interests with you.
Well, I thank you for telling that story. And it is interesting because you're right, like pre-internet days or pre-web days, magazines were the thing that were timely, they were visual, they did spark that community discussion that you didn't get necessarily out of a book out of the library or even the news that you got that was the news is dynamic, the books are static, but that the magazines really sort of took it to another level. And I think one of the things I loved, you mentioned the Rolling Stone, but for technology. And that was one of the things that struck me in your conversation. I listened for some background research to the Marketecture podcast. And one of the things that was discussed was the fact that technology back then was not cool. Like you were a nerd or you were a business person, but there wasn't really any in between,
Right.
and you all made that sort of technology interesting and you told interesting stories. And I think one of the things that probably didn't hurt is like you had Negroponte, from MIT. This is a guy that knows technology better than almost anyone in the world, right? And so he's helping to provide that digital breadcrumb trail that people can follow. I do want to sort of take that to the next step though, because after you're at Wired and you realize there's this thing called the World Wide Web. And I think you even mentioned that you happened to do in 6 point type a little bit of a blurb in your first edition of Wired about
Yeah.
this thing called the, World Wide Web that was going
Yeah.
to have a pretty profound impact. But while you were doing this, you realized that there was something that needed to track this .com boom that was happening. People, all you had to do is mention something around World Wide Web and people were throwing money at it. So let's talk a little bit about this company that you build called the Industry Standard. And you also tell some stories on the podcast about the boom and bust days where you're out in San Francisco at your highest peak. You've got 300 pages of ads at like $25,000. And then all of a sudden the bottom falls out. So tell us a little bit about that journey, John.
Yeah. So in the second half of my time at Wired, which was, I guess that would be 96, 97, I was in charge not just of the editorial, but also the business development. And the reason that Lewis asked me to do that was that we were very precious about what the Wired brand was. And so Lewis wanted an editorial person to be in charge of business development so that we made decisions that were consistent with the Wired brand. And, we did some crazy stuff, but we also did some obvious stuff, editions in Japan, in Europe, business development deals with various, online partners, things like that. But the thing that I thought we should do was to cover the internet as a business story. It struck me starting in 96, 97 that there was so much going on. Netscape had gone public. There was clearly an energy in San Francisco, particularly, that was palpable, but it needed journalism. It was getting hyped to an extent that made me uncomfortable. Um, and so I propose that we do that we launch a weekly magazine with an accompanying, website and maybe some research and, conference business attached to it. Since it was a business focused audience, conferences made sense to me. Um, and Lewis and Kevin, who were the three of us were sort of the editorial cabal, just didn't think it was sexy enough. No, it's like it wasn't enough. There wasn't very Wired, right? It's like it's a business story. That's I had done on most of the business coverage in Wired. I either wrote the pieces myself or I assigned and edited all the pieces on business. But that was only 15 or 20% of what Wired did. So they thought, drilling down into that vertical might be a good idea, but not very wired. So I left to do it myself, and that was the first time that I was a startup CEO. And that was 1997 when I left, and 98 when we launched the standard industry standard. And we put a remarkable team together, and got backing from a very large trade publisher named IDG. At the time, kind of the dominant technology publication business in the world. And the industry standard struggled for a year as we tried to define a market of business people who cared about the internet. But then all of a sudden, by late 98, everybody seemed to care about it and everybody wanted to be a part of it. And we had built sort of a vehicle for people to declare they were part of that. And we then, so failed by succeeding, if you will. I mean, we succeeded so much that we overexpanded. And then when the bottom fell out of the greater market in the internet in the mid 2000 timeframe, we lost 75% of our revenues in one quarter, which, is really hard to come back from.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And there are a lot of other stories about, what went on there in those 5 years. But at the end of the day, it was an incredible education. And I'm still proud of the work we did at the Standard. It was really high quality journalism and a great set of products that, kind of set up the next 20 years of my career.
Well, one of the things you mentioned that I had forgotten about is that you were known for your events as well as the publication itself. And you and I were talking sort of our pre-discussion about this community building, and I think people that have lasted through all these different generations of technology, the digital, social, mobile, have been involved in community building, and it's made a huge difference. One of the things that you pulled out of this, and I, with all due respect, because I know that you've done a lot of other things, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But you built something called the Web2 Summit with a guy named Tim O'Reilly, and this launched in 2003, and it ran through to 2011. And I was also saying to you in our front, like, I forgot just how much of a fingerprint you had on today's sort of world of digital and Web 2 and what things have evolved to. But talk about what it was like curating the narrative and hosting the forefathers and mothers of today's digital world.
Yeah, so thanks for remembering Web 2. That was a pretty remarkable run that we had from, almost 10 years. That came out of a conversation that I had with Tim O'Reilly, who's, kind of a legendary figure in tech and in the internet. After the crash, Tim had started a very informal event called Friends of O'Reilly. And you literally went up to his headquarters at the time of O'Reilly Media in Sebastopol, which is this sleepy rural area north of San Francisco. Most people went up there and camped, and so that's called Foo Camp. And
Mm.
Tim had just set up whiteboards on one side of a building, and everyone just made up what they wanted to talk about. Right. And then they joined different groups. And it was sort of the first unconference. And I went to the 2003, maybe 2002 version of that, kind of still licking my wounds after the death of the Standard, and reconnected with Tim. And we realized that there was something happening, that the crash had left a lot of built infrastructure. It had left a lot of really good ideas that maybe were done hastily or poorly or too early or all three, but that a sort of rugged set of entrepreneurs was emerging that was building on top of the sort of wreckage of the first version of the web that blew up. And that a new set of technologies on top of that were making a lot of the dreams possible that we had in the late 90s. And those were interactive technologies like Ajax and others that we built on for, a good 5 or 10 years after that. So Tim had already said, I think maybe we should do an event around this. And he had been discussing it with a couple of his colleagues. And I was very enthusiastic about that. I had done a big internet event with the industry standard, and so I had some background in doing it. So we agreed to partner and start what became Web 2. And it was kind of one of those events that happens, I guess, once in a generation or as an industry forms. Everybody wanted to go. It was, you couldn't, like, sell enough tickets, right? We had to turn away people. It didn't matter the cost. We couldn't, the same with the sponsorship. So this was a very successful event that, because of my journalistic background, I wanted to run it with integrity on stage. So we didn't sell on stage speaking slots. Everybody who spoke because they wanted to be in front of the community that we had gathered there. And a lot of things came out of Web2. I mean, I have too many to count, but the people who came on stage were remarkable, and they turned out to be the people that are running kind of, household names now. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Eric Schmidt, Sergey Brin, Steve Ballmer, like the people who, are very well known today as Peter Thiel, all the, you name it. They were there, and they were there in a context of, we're building something new. Ask me anything, as opposed to, we control the world. Shut the fuck up. And so that's the difference between 2005 and 2025. Is the tech industry was just really starting to understand that it had uh, a profound effect on society, and that effect was being expressed through the raw execution of capitalism. And that was a great era, which by 2011, I kind of felt like it was time to stop doing that event, because it was starting to feel like maybe, the truth wasn't getting examined as hard as it should have anymore, and that the industry was starting to circle its wagons, you know, act like a power broker as opposed to an idealistic community. And I didn't know quite how to crack that. And I did spend quite a bit of time afterwards trying to figure that out. And I think I still am.
Well, so a few things unpacked. One, I was today years old when I made the connection of Food Camp, which early days of digital I remember hearing about, but I never knew that that was Friends of O'Reilly that was the Foo and Food Camp. So
Yeah.
thank you for enlightening me on that one. I will say that going to some of those conferences, it did feel like there's an electricity in the air. You knew something really special was happening.
Yeah,
And we're going
exactly.
to talk a little bit about this in a few more minutes, but I do feel like generative AI is starting to feel a little bit like that. I don't know as though there's a convening of like there was with what you did. I'd say South by Southwest carried that forward for a while. I'm not sure they're still there at this point in terms of what that means. But one of the things that I do want to carry forward is this idea of convening and talking about important ideas. And so apologies for skipping over some of the important things you've done, like Federated Media Publishing and Sovereign Holdings and the recount, mainly for timing. There was another event sort of platform that you created, and it was called NewCo. I think OpenCo originally, and then NewCo. And I loved the way you described it. It was sort of funny to try to share it with other people, but at the same time, I loved the differentiation. It was the city-based festivals for innovative companies. And I remember, John, the thing that was crazy, because you were kind enough to let me come and podcast, you had people like Tyler Florence, the celebrity chef who did the food truck challenge. You had rappers, you had, the mayor of Pittsburgh and Oakland doing panels. Just so Steph Curry, the famous basketball player from the Golden State Warriors. Talk a little bit more about the company and then what brought that venture to an end, because it did feel like you had a good run for a while.
Yeah.
I think you ran it for 3, 4, 5 years, but it really was a fascinating mix of people with really like there was an energy to those as well, even though they were a little more boutique, I think, than the Web 2.0 conference events that you held.
Yeah, thanks for remembering it. I mean, I don't get asked about it very often, and I think one of the reasons is it was ephemeral. It's not like, you can still pick up old editions of Wired or the industry standard, and people remember gathering at Web 2 because there were almost 2,000 people in one place for 3 days. NewCo was a very different concept, perhaps crazy, because it was inside out. I had been going to a lot of music festivals in the early 2000s, Bonnaroo and ACL and, Coachella. And the thing that I loved about them was that they had these stages spread across very large distances, and you would pick your own schedule and go see the bands you wanted to see in these different areas, different stages. I actually met the people who built the software behind the application that allowed you to do all that picking. And it just struck me that there were bands forming all around the world, not musical bands, but people who were using essentially Web2 technologies to build new kinds of companies. And that it wasn't quite as, you know, black and white as I might make it out to be right now, but there were kind of good companies and then there were not so good companies.
Hmm.
And the good companies, I thought, were companies that were being driven by a mission to, in some way, make the world that they inhabited a little better place. So it wasn't just raw capitalism. It was capitalism, but with a purpose. And I thought it would be cool to create a new kind of a platform that highlighted and celebrated those kinds of companies. So there was an editorial, wrapper around it, as there is with everything I've ever done, right? And it was, we will choose the companies that, are good, that are good enough to be on the NewCo platform. And then another big part of the philosophy was these companies, because of the Web2 platform that had been built across the internet, they could be anywhere. They didn't have to be in San Francisco or Boston or New York or Austin. They could be anywhere in the world and, accessing cloud-based systems and so on and so forth. And so the idea of NewCo was to do these inside out festivals in cities around the world, where instead of everyone coming to one place like we did at Web2, you would instead distribute the audience out to the city, and they would go into the headquarters of all these different companies. And the companies would present in their headquarters. And the idea was, you really can't get to know a company unless you see physically and meet physically the people who run the company. That's such a funny idea given what happened in 2020, which is the year that NewCo ended. As you can imagine, it's kind of hard to run an event series like that when everyone's afraid of dying because they're in a room with other people, and particularly a room like 12 rooms in a day, right? 12 different places. So, that was the final kind of nail in the coffin for NewCo, was the pandemic. But to be honest, it was very hard to develop a business model that made any sort of long-term sustainable sense when you're asking your audience to do as much work as we were asking, which is, set up it's exhausting. Like in Amsterdam or in Barcelona or in Shanghai or, San Francisco, wherever you were, you might go to 10 different places in a day. That's exhausting. So to ask someone to also give you $1,000 to do it, that was, sort of more than we could do. We couldn't really, we charged, I think the most was $195. So I was trying to get sponsors to support it, but sponsors really like to have a lot of people in one place where they can gather leads and do the things that sponsors do at events. So that wasn't working out as well either. And I had a database idea, and there's a whole story behind that didn't end up panning out for a number of reasons. But it just wasn't a very viable business without kind of a big underwriter who wanted this platform for maybe a secondary purpose. And so we sold the assets of that company to the largest marketing communications company in Canada. And they were planning on expanding it and running it as they expanded into the United States and into Asia. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit and that all kind of stopped. So that's what happened there.
Well, it's interesting. And I remember as you were talking through that, like that very distributed. I think we even, when I was working at Real Chemistry, we had one of the events at our New York office, and there was a lot of excitement around it because we were part of something bigger. But thank you for sharing that story as well. And I had some amazing experiences with it. And I think the thing that you do, John, is you are a connector. You mentioned some of the tech giants that you had and hosted, but there are all these other people in your lives, the guys that ran The Circus, the TV show on HBO, and a number of others that, are just profound influencers on society. Speaking of getting profound, one of the things I want to drill into is in 2023, you have a search blog, which is your book was about search. I think the name of it was Search that you wrote. You mentioned that a while back, but you maintain this blog. One of the entries that you did really struck me. And you mentioned transitioning from being work driven to being life driven. So, given someone that has done all of the things that you've done and built the businesses that you've built, tell us more about this. And then how's it going 2 years later?
Yeah, I wrote that post a couple of years ago, but I've been thinking about the things in that post for almost a decade now. I think when I often use the metaphor of bands and music. I think I've already used it in this conversation. You know, I managed to join a band and we had, series of hit albums, right? That was Wired. We could almost do no wrong for 3 or 4 years there. And so when you have that kind of success very early in your life, I mean, I I had plans to move to New York and be a freelance writer and cover technology for all the Condé Nast magazines. Essentially, that's what I thought I was going to do after graduate school. But I ended up instead editing some of the most talented writers in the world for 5 years. And when you have that kind of an experience, work becomes your life. I mean, I was at the office all the time. And I had fallen in love with a woman who was in New York, and I was planning to move to New York to be with her. And then instead, she moved to San Francisco. And, the only way we could either ever see each other is she just joined me at Wired. She just started working there. So it was like our whole life was around work. And that habit continued for 3 or 4 companies in a row. Yeah, of course. And we had children, and I did everything I could to be a good father and parent and husband. But at the same time, if you make work your number one priority, there's always going to be a number two. Something is behind that. Um, in 2018, our youngest, was in that key transition between eighth grade and high school. And my wife and I and our other 2 children were older and they were already in college. And so we had this unique moment of transition where we decided that we were going to make a life decision, not a work decision. And so we moved to New York from San Francisco, partly motivated by a little bit of disillusionment with the what had happened with the Silicon Valley culture. It was starting to feel very mercenary. And so I didn't move to New York for work. And that was the beginning of what ended up with that post you noticed, right? Was I made a decision that was not driven by anything other than life things, my daughter's education, my wife's desire to get back to the East Coast where she lived prior to, moving out for our work at Wired. And then the pandemic hit, shortly thereafter, a year and a half after we moved. I had, of course, started another company and taken a full-time job teaching at Columbia. But that pandemic just sort of, really focused, I think, everybody on what's important to each person. And for me, it was to live a life that felt a little more grounded. And so we moved from New York. We still have a place there, but we moved from New York to Martha's Vineyard, which is a small island off the coast of Massachusetts that's well known because it's a political football currently. But I have 4 or 5 generations of my family buried here. And it's been a place that I've come mostly for the summers for my whole life. And our family came here once we had children every summer. So it was a very meaningful place. And it's probably the only place that I knew of on the East Coast that felt like California in terms of its natural beauty and its sort of pace of life. But it doesn't have a tech industry. So it doesn't have that, go to the market and get besieged by people who want to pitch a startup idea or talk about, ad tech. Right. So I realized that for the next chapter, which will be, the sort of, final chapter or chapters of my career. I want my career to be driven by my life, not my life to be driven by my career. And I'm very fortunate to be in a position to be able to make that change because there's financial consequences to that, at least in the short term. It's, so far it's been a journey. It's, as you point out, it's been 2 years and I've started a couple of things and I've gotten involved in a number of other projects, but what I'm missing that I don't know whether or not, to be honest, is something I should be missing, is a central organizing thing that I'm doing. That's one thing, right? So when I go to a dinner party and I don't know people and they say, "What do you do?" I go, "Man, do you want the long version or the really long version?" Like I don't have a shorthand while I'm CEO of this startup company, right? And so it's been a transition to be more project driven than company driven.
Well, funny anecdote. I appreciate you saying that, by the way. The whole, I think we all could use a little bit of being more life driven than work driven, and that's ironically, something over the last 18 months I've really been thinking a lot about. A funny anecdote is I'm from New England originally myself, born in Maine, grew up in Massachusetts. And my wife, while we were working in Boston, had a boss. He was also from Maine, and he was a nice guy, a little provincial. And on the news, back when we watched the weather on the news, they would always
Uh-huh.
talk about this place called the Cape and Islands because it's Cape Cod and the islands are Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket.
Right.
Well, he was one day talking to her and was like, blah, 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 Cape and Islands. And she's like, did you just say the Cape on it? Like Capon Islands. He didn't realize that it was the Cape and the islands. And so when you're mentioning Martha's Vineyard, that came to mind. One of the things though, John, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is you do have themes in your life, right? So obviously, I think this journalistic integrity has been a key piece, community building, academia, which we'll talk about in a second, and really being purpose driven. And one of the things that I really was excited to learn about, and this show is about influential people who are doing societal good. Last year, you and your co-founders, this is how I found that passage, by the way, in your blog, but you and your co-founders, Dr. Jordan Schlane and Kevin Ryan, announced the creation of a new community called DOC, D-O-C. I'll let you talk to the audience about what that stands for, but share a little bit more about this important health-focused organization and where are you in your trajectory? I know you've hosted, I think, an event or two, but tell us more about that.
Yeah, Doc. It's funny. Doc is an acronym, but a fluid one. When we initially put it together, the idea was to bring together a community of people who care deeply about advancement in medicine, but also care deeply about integrity in medicine. And this was because Jordan in particular, who's been a long-term, friend of mine. He was in fact my doctor for 15 years when I was on the West Coast. He's a very successful doctor who has seen, an incredible advancement in technology during his practice over the last 25 or 30 years. And he catered to Silicon Valley elite, as were his clientele. And his his observation was that, because of the intersection of technology and science on medicine, the advancements in the field were starting to essentially outstrip society's ability to understand them. That created a gap in information that was being taken advantage of by the charlatans, the hucksters, the opportunists, which felt to me an awful lot like the cycles we've seen in technology over and over again. Some technology outstrips our ability to understand it, and then everybody tries to sell you understanding back, in some way or another. It happened with the early web, it happened, with mobile and social, it happened with crypto, and it's happening with AI. And it's absolutely happening with healthcare. Plus, you've got a massive segment of the economy, over 20% of the GDP in the United States, that is essentially broken. It doesn't work right. It works very well for wealthy people. It doesn't work very well for anybody else. And even wealthy people are unhappy. The category that seems to be pushing the frontiers of medicine the most, and the category that seems to have the most bullshit in it, is longevity. And the Silicon Valley is obsessed with longevity. It's a running joke. It was in that great series, Silicon Valley, I've got my young boy blood. I've got my, cold plunge and my this and my that. There's just so much bullshit, but there's also so much amazing advancement that we thought there needed to be a community that was focused on what's real and rigorous and has scientific integrity that you can apply to your personal life and or to what you might be interested in investing in or contributing to research in if you're a philanthropy right now, not in 5 years, right now. And so that's what doc is about. We started it as an event, and the doc initially was doctors, because we're focused on people who are scientists, doctors,
Right.
original, that have original ideas, and credibility, doc. Now it's just doc. And I actually saw an AI summary yesterday. I was looking up something that related to the doc website, and I put in doc and some other, prompt. And the AI said that DOC stood for Doctor's Own Conference. I'm like, where did it come up with that? I had never heard that one. But it is, in fact, there are about 300 people who come. and about a third of them are doctors or PhDs, entrepreneurs, investors, philanthropists, people interested in the field in one way or another. And it is really cool, I have to say. Very proud of it. It's small, but we have big plans. We're hiring a CEO to run the business, and we'll be making announcements about that probably next year, early next year. And we're excited. So we've done 2 events. It's in Northern California and Napa, and they've gone very well. And we're hoping that we can, kind of take it, particularly now, Aaron, as you're well aware, and probably the audience listening is very well aware. Science is under attack and being defunded, and incredible amounts of controversy around what constitutes truth in medicine, truth in science these days. So, I didn't realize 2.5 years ago when we decided to do this that it would be as politically charged idea, but fuck it. I mean, without science, where are we? We're not having this conversation,
No,
you know?
no, no,
so,
for sure.
so like, I think institutions that defend, the rigors of how scientific debate works, which includes, by the way, strongly held opinions, but a willingness to let them go easily when you see data that proves that your opinion was wrong. I think democracy could learn a lot from that approach.
From your mouth to God's ears, for sure. And by the way, as someone that's worked in healthcare for a few years, if you ever need speaker ideas or invitees, I've got a few in the network. And to your
Awesome.
point, a lot listening to this show today. Two more questions, and then we'll get into some fun ones or lighter ones. But one of the things, and we touched on this earlier, you've done a fair amount of teaching over the years. You mentioned Columbia, you mentioned Cal Berkeley. Can you talk about what keeps you connected to academia?
My first teaching experience was over 20 years ago, 2001, the dot-com crash. I was essentially out of a job, unsure what I was going to do with my life. And a colleague of mine was the dean of the Graduate School of Journalism, which I had stayed in touch with because I had graduated from there 10 years previously. He called me up and asked me if I wanted to come teach there. I remember sitting in his office having the conversation with him, thinking, well, geez, at least Berkeley could give you some health care. And I mean, the pay is terrible, but it's a platform. It's a place to land after a very rough period in my life. And he said to me, any port in a storm, John. And so I did end up taking that role. And I found, particularly at the graduate level, the students were really challenging and really interesting and really smart and really optimistic. And it reminded me of myself when, I was, at least very optimistic. And I really enjoyed the teaching part of it. And it forces you to organize your ideas. Then they get challenged by young people who don't know better, who don't have preset, And so I really enjoyed that process. And it was from 2001 to 2004 or five, the most productive, I think, 3 or 4 years of my entire career, because that's when I came up with the idea for what became the book, what became Web2, which we discussed, what became Federated Media, which was one of the most successful companies I was involved with, and a host of other things that I did during that period. And it was all because I kind of had the academic umbrella of Berkeley. When I moved to New York, as I mentioned in 2018, I landed at Columbia. And again, 4 or 5 years I spent there doing research on topics that I really cared about. I was not at the journalism school. I was at the School of International Public Affairs, which is one of the top and largest public affairs schools, policy related, Again, I mean, we're talking about students from all over the world, and really learned a lot from them at that school. I then when I moved to the Vineyard, I moved to a Boston school, Northeastern, and I taught there for a year. And I took last year off because I wanted, I was basically spending too much time going back and forth to Boston. But I am going back to Berkeley to teach a seminar next month, actually. And I'm really looking forward to that. So staying connected to it almost creates a space, at least in my mind, where I can relax into ideas and try them out and test and learn in sort of the relative safety of an academic setting. And so that's why I've always wanted to stay connected to it.
I think there's probably one other thing too, which is that youth and that ability to connect to fresh ideas, which you touched on. And
Yeah.
I think you also touched on something with the music, with the learning and the reading. And one of the things I really try to make a conscious effort to do is I love to go to music festivals. I love to not go to the big stages, but discover new music at the smaller stages.
Yeah, totally.
And then I think, one of the things I loved when I was at Real Chemistry is my team was all younger than I was, and just really trying to stay connected to what they were watching, what they were listening to, how they were sort of, interacting on the socials. And I think there are people that are like you and me that allow themselves to become grumpy old men or grumpy old women and eschew those opportunities to do those things. So I love that you have stayed connected to academia, and obviously you've been at some of the most prestigious institutions in the world. One final question before we get into some of the, more frivolous, and this is we touched on earlier. It feels like generative AI, which we're living through now. AI has been around for a while, by the way. I know people forget that. It's like
Yeah.
this thing just got created yesterday. It's been around for almost, some definitions say 100 years, but generative AI the last 2 or 3 years, ChatGPT really the thing that made it popular. I think it might be having the same transformational impact on society that the World Wide Web did back in the early 90s. So, one, do you agree? And if so, beyond the obvious, where will it have its greatest impact in the short term, which I define as like the next 1 to 3 years, and the long term, the next 5 to 10 years? I know that's a big, big question and lots to digest, but
Yeah, it is. And if I had definitive answers to it,
you'd be a
good
rich
Lord,
man.
maybe I'd be starting another company. But I have some thoughts. So, first of all, yes, I do agree that this set of technologies has the potential to be as impactful as the World Wide Web. It's difficult to ascertain definitively whether that opinion is true because the before and after of the web is very stark, right? One could say that generative AI is, in hindsight, say 10, 15 years when we're looking back, a really important evolution of the web. It's just the web. So one could say then, therefore, it's not as important as the birth of the web, right? Maybe this is, the web coming into the equivalent of, you know, full throated adulthood. But it does feel uh, very similar in its in the excitement around it, in the questions around it, in the uncertainty and the opportunity. That said, we are now you know at full take, right? It's not like the thing about the web was if you were using it and you were really, schooled in it, if you had learned HTML in 1995 or 4, um, you were one of a very small group of people. Um, that's just not the case with generative AI. Everyone was already on the internet, and then this happened, right? Which is why it's been such a head spinning, pace of change, and there's so much excitement and uncertainty about what's next. I do think in 1 to 3 years we should have an answer to the question that everyone is talking about, which is when, if ever, will we get artificial general intelligence? If it's generally defined as a machine intelligence that can do the work of a white collar professional without any corrections or prompting. And I think if we get that answer, and that answer is affirmative, positive, we are going to have a reordering of almost every social construct we understand today. Now, that reordering, we predicted at Wired in 1993. I mean, we were certain that digital technologies were going to reorder all of social construct. I mean, it's astonishing the arrogance of our editorial meetings at the time, but I remember them. We sat there and go, okay, well, how is education going to change? Let's get a reporter and do a story on that. When, there was literally no proof anywhere from a reporting standpoint that anything had changed at all.
Right.
But we were so certain it was going to happen that we hired science fiction writers to go write stories about what was going to change, right? So, in a way, this is a progression of what kind of, at least the narrative I've been obsessed with my whole career. This feels like here we are. We got here. It's about to happen. I don't know on the long term part of your question. It hinges on the short term. And I'm not an expert, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about this, but I think no matter what, we are going to have significant social reorderings, even as we try to figure out what to do with the impact of the last 5 or 10 years, right? If you look at today or yesterday's news, Australia just, put into effect a ban on social media for kids under 16. Why did they do that? I think we know why. It's just we're not Australia here in the United States, and we'll never do that. But it's interesting that they did. And this is at the exact moment that these surfaces have become breeding grounds for artificial intelligence in a way that they never have been before. So it's a fascinating moment to be studying this stuff. And that's one of the reasons I'm interested in, doing a little bit more chin stroking. And that's why an academic setting makes sense for me, at least for a little bit.
Well, I love the honest answer because I think you're right. No one knows where this is going. And it is interesting to think back to the 90s, probably go all the way back to like the 60s and 70s when you had shows like the Jetsons and Star Trek. And I think if humankind can imagine things, you're right. Like we're just now manifesting those things that we imagined, even War of the Worlds, right? These things are all, a lot of them are coming true. And it is interesting to think about the social reordering. And I don't know if you watch the show Pluribus, but it's opening up a lot of like these very big societal questions of, what defines humanity. And anyway, I won't digress too much because I know we're closing in on time, but I do have a few fast paced questions that I'll ask you and then we can wrap up. This is one that I've sort of gone off and on. Some guests I feel more comfortable asking and some not, but I think I know you well enough that I can ask this. So, what's a word that sounds dirty but isn't?
Moist.
I think if we were playing Jeopardy, that's the one, or no, what is it? A Family Feud. That's the number one answer
That
on
would
the
have to be
board,
the
right?
number one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, and this one I'm really fascinated because you have met some truly amazing people because I've seen you interview them. But out of all of these folks that you've met in your life, who has impressed you the most?
Oh, man, that's a good one. Who has impressed me the most?
I'll tell you, I asked Katie Couric this similar question on an interview several years ago, and she got mad at me. She's like, "Aaron, I've interviewed presidents of the United States and the Queen and all these other people. So how can you make me pick my favorite
Okay, well,
child?"
the first name that comes to mind, and it might because you name checked him, is Steph Curry. I'm obviously incredibly impressive, just resume wise, his accomplishments on the court. But I did not expect him to be as just cool and humble a dude as he turned out to be. So that'll be that's who comes to mind immediately.
I think that's a good one, and I think knowing enough to be dangerous because I live out in the Bay Area, he is a very sort of deep, smart, good person, and that doesn't always come hand in hand with someone that's the face of the NBA right now. And
Right.
so I love that you're choosing that one.
Right.
A little heavier one, but biggest regret.
Man. Well, in business, it would probably be not knowing when to quit. And there's a hard one lesson over many, many companies, but the hardest one was the industry standard. I absolutely knew I should have left that company that I built a year or two before I ended up leaving it. And so I guess that would be my, biggest, certainly business regret. I don't know about personal. I'm pretty happy with how things have turned out.
And that's okay. And, I think we should all be in that same driver's seat. We've talked about music before, so this will also be one that I'm curious about. Which band or artist, ideally one that's no longer available to see, would you have most liked to have seen?
Well, I mean, the very first thing that comes to mind is Zeppelin. They were playing when I was going to shows in the, 70s, but I was young, very young. But that music was so important to me, and I never saw them play. I would have loved to see them play. Of course, if you're talking about bands that weren't playing when I was capable of going to a concert, then I would have loved to see the Beatles.
Beatles is one that comes up regularly. I do love that you chose Led Zeppelin, and I have seen recently that they've started to release some like archival footage of them in concert, and it's kind of profound to see these bands that you've listened to on the radio or the albums are now on Spotify to see them performing and just the energy and how good they were at their craft. So great
Yeah, no, I
choice.
saw the documentary, and I'm an amateur drummer. You can see the drums.
I did notice the drum in the background for those watching.
I have several kits, but that's my practice kit back there. And I don't practice as much as I should. But a documentary on Zeppelin did, there wasn't much Bonham in there. Bonham did not like the spotlight, and I was pissed about that because like I want to see him playing.
Yeah. And some consider arguably the best drummer that ever has lived or walked this earth. So
Yeah, certainly the
you're
most
right. That
natural.
would be it. Yeah. So, last question, and this is a little bit self serving for you, but we've talked about some of these places. Where would you like people to read you, engage with you, and maybe help with some of your social causes like Doc, et cetera?
Yeah. I think the best way to follow me is I've got a you mentioned generously mentioned my site. It's battellemedia.com. That's my very old blog. And that's where anything I write goes up there. But it also goes to LinkedIn. And that's kind of where I'm most engaged, although I wouldn't say I don't spend a lot of time trying to game the LinkedIn algorithms, but I'm pretty active there. I left Twitter, where I had a pretty large following, 3 years ago when Elon bought it. And I'm not really active anywhere else um, by choice. I just feel like I can't give that energy to those companies. So I'm not on Instagram, and I'm not on X, and and LinkedIn. I'm not I'm not I'm not negative on LinkedIn, but I do feel like there's there's a lot of tomfoolery that goes on.
That's a good way to put it. And, in spite of all that, you still managed to rack up, I think, like 250 or 275,000 followers. So clearly you're doing something right, John. But on that note, I will put the Battelle Media link in the news or in the show notes, especially the link to the blog. Thank you for your time today. And it's just always such a pleasure to talk to you. I really love your integrity and how you show up in the world. And thank you for all the good that you've put into it and will continue to put into it.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time, and the audience is listening. Thank you for listening. And, let's do it again sometime. And good luck with
Sounds
everything
like a
you're
plan.
doing in the future.
All right. Well, thank you, John.
Take care.